The man learned a history as Edward II was born on the 25th of April 1284 at Carnarvon Castle in northwestern Wales. Edward was born on the feast day of St. Mark the Evangelist, and at birth was given the title Lord Edward of Carnarvon. He was the fourth son of his father King Edward I, after whom he was named, who himself was named after his father King Henry's favorite saint, Edward the Confessor. Edward's Spanish mother, Queen Eleanor of Castile, was 42 when she gave birth to Edward, her youngest child. She was born in 1241, the daughter of King Fernando III of Castile and Leon, who was later canonized as San Fernando. Despite the great celebrations on his arrival, Edward was not born an heir, as his elder brother Alfonso was alive when Edward was born. However, Alfonso unfortunately came to an untimely end on the 19th of August 1284, at the age of 10, when Edward was only 4 months old, making Edward heir to the throne of England, although he would not be made Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester until the 7th of February 1301, and he received the Duchy of Aquitaine from his father on the 7th of April 1306, just 6 weeks before he was knighted at Westminster Abbey. 2 other sons of King Edward I and Queen Eleanor, John and Henry, had died at the ages of 5 and 6 in 1271 and 1274 respectively, making the only remaining son precious indeed. But Lord Edward was a hardy child who only suffered from one reported illness during his childhood, which was a tertian fever, shortly after he turned 10 years of age. King Edward I and Queen Eleanor also had 10 daughters, only 5 of whom survived to adulthood. Lord Edward was born in Wales a year after his father had conquered the region, and he would leave Wales at just a few months old and would not return until shortly before his 17th birthday in April 1301. Furthermore, at the time of his birth, Lord Edward was proclaimed a great portent or omen of a great or significant happening. Some said that the end of the world was near and that Edward would be a latter-day King Arthur, leading England to great glory. The first great loss that Edward II experienced was at the age of 6, with the death of his mother Eleanor on the 28th of November 1290. It was said that King Edward I grieved greatly for his queen, building the Eleanor crosses in her memory, which were crosses built at the 12 places that the Queen's funeral procession had stopped on the way to Westminster, and it was on Queen Eleanor's death that 6-year-old Edward inherited the title Count of Ponthieu from her. 7 months later, Edward would also lose his paternal grandmother Eleanor of Provence, widow of Henry III, and it could be said that the lack of a guiding maternal figure in Edward's young life may have affected him emotionally in later life. But Edward was not completely without female care, as he was looked after by a wet nurse as a baby called Mary or Mariotta Monsell, who would later be replaced by Alice de Lagrave when Mary became ill. Young Edward would not have had much contact in his early years with his natural mother Eleanor, as she would be away in the Duchy of Aquitaine with Edward's father for much of his infancy, and so Edward was cared for as a baby by employees of the king under the direction of a clerk named Giles of Oudenarde, and later as he grew, he would be educated by Dominican friars and his tutor, Sir Guy Thayer. During his early years, Edward would spend the winters at Langley near St. Albans, and during the summer, he would tour around the south of England and the Midlands with his entourage in tow, and the meals and horse care his party needed would often put a burden on the local townsfolk due to the party's numbers. As well as a large staff, Edward also had the companionship of several children of high birth who were accorded as part of his household during the 1290s, such as Maud Choworth, granddaughter of the Earl of Warwick, Eleanor de Burgh, eldest daughter of the Earl of Ulster, and Humphrey de Bohun, heir to the earldom of Hereford, and in the early 1300s, the nephew of the Earl of Gloucester, Gilbert de Clare, who was Lord of Thomond in Ireland, Hugh de Spencer, when he was a boy, and Piers Gaveston, a noble from France, were also part of his household, and indeed, Piers Gaveston was originally a squire in Edward I's household and was recorded in the records by the nickname Pero. Physically, Edward II was a striking figure. He was kingly, tall and handsome, lacking his father's lisp or his grandfather Henry III's drooping eye. He was elegant and strong, and his fair curly hair fell almost to his shoulders and was parted in the middle. He also wore a moustache and a beard, and when he came to the throne, he was seen at first as a breath of fresh air. After the long 35-year reign of his father, he was athletic, a good horseman like his father, and popular at first. But public opinion was soon to change when knowledge of his strange pastimes became known. Edward would swim, row and dig ditches, gamble and even thatch roofs. He was also not fond of warfare, and he did not like to hold tournaments. Some thought his unkingly behavior indicated that this man was not suited or indeed happy with his lot as King of England, and would not live up to his father's reputation. The chronicler Ranulph Higden claimed that Edward preferred the company of jesters, carriage drivers, diggers and sailors to the company of knights, and indeed, there are records of dinner guests of Edward's that include sailors, barge masters and carpenters. It is true that Edward II's reputation with his people and with the nobles at court and even with his own father would suffer from his pursuit of unsuitable pastimes, and also his seeming obsession with unsuitable favorites, whom he would shower with privileges. The first, and perhaps most famous of Edward's favorites, was the son of Arnaud de Gabaston, a Gascon knight and vassal to Edward I in his role as Duke of Aquitaine, who served with Edward I during the Welsh Wars of 1282 to 1283. The son's name was Piers Gaveston. It was Edward I who initially sent Piers Gaveston to live in his son's household when Edward was just 16, as he had impressed Edward I with his military prowess when he served in his army in Flanders in 1297 and also in Scotland in 1300. It is thought that Edward I placed Gaveston in his son's household to act as a role model, as he was an excellent jouster, brilliant soldier, and was very courageous, and according to the chronicler Geoffrey Baker, he was agile in body and also graceful, refined, and well-versed in military matters. In 1304, at the request of young Edward, the king gave Gaveston the wardship of Roger Mortimer of Wigmore after the death of his father. This act showed that the king had confidence in his son's companion at that time, as he would have charge of Mortimer's possessions until the child came of age. Piers Gaveston was of noble birth, his family being from the village of Gabaston close to the Pyrenees, from which the family took their name. He is thought to have been older than Edward, a flamboyant character, who was a member of Edward I's household from November 1297. However, by 1303, Gaveston was described as Edward II's companion, and Edward was known to show him great affection in public, and indeed, it was blatant that Edward loved the man. But whether it was a brotherly love or some deeper sexual attraction is a subject of debate among scholars. One school of thought suggests that despite the great love Edward II had for Piers Gaveston, it was not necessarily a romantic love as we know it today, as the bonds of love and brotherhood between men were common during this time, and indeed, at the time Edward referred to Gaveston as our dear and faithful brother, and one chronicle calls him a great earl whom the king had adopted as a brother, and the French historian Pierre Chaplet suggested that the relationship might have been one of adoptive brotherhood, in which each participant pledges support to the other as if they were brothers. It is indisputable that Gaveston did hold great influence over Edward. However, the idea that their relationship was sexual was largely due to the play of 1592 by Christopher Marlowe called Edward II. But the words of an anonymous chronicler from the 1320s have also been interpreted as suggestive of a sexual element to their relationship, although the words used, such as indissoluble love, covenant of constancy, and fastened with a knot, do not suggest sexual overtones at all, but are quite vague, and indeed, it was the case at the time that sodomy was a heresy and was condemned by the Church in 14th century England, so it was not something that Edward, either as heir to the crown or indeed as king, would have undertaken lightly. The first blatant reference to homosexuality came in 1334, when the Bishop of Winchester, Adam Allerton, was accused of saying that Edward was a sodomite, but he later defended himself by saying that he had in fact been referring to Hugh Despenser the Younger, and not the late king himself. It has also been suggested that the comments were in large part politically motivated. After this, in the 1390s, the Mo Chronicle noted that Edward gave himself, quote, too much to the vice of sodomy, that it has been suggested that such allegations may have been influenced by Allerton's original comment, which was later retracted. In fact, both Gaveston and Edward II had sexual relationships with their wives and fathered children with them, and Edward also fathered an illegitimate son, Adam, at some time between 1305 and 1310, when he was in his 20s, and was also said to have had an affair with his niece, Eleanor de Clare. Furthermore, historians such as Seymour Phillips and Michael Prestwich make the point that the public nature of the English royal court would have made keeping a homosexual affair secret almost impossible. It is also the case that the Church at the time, as well as Edward's father and father-in-law, made no known critical comments about Edward's sex life. Although the exact nature of the relationship between Edward and Piers Gaveston is uncertain, it is known that the favoritism shown to Gaveston caused widespread resentment and jealousy throughout the kingdom, not least because of the arrogance that Gaveston was said to have shown, and this fact was not lost on the king, who perhaps felt that the actions of his young heir would only serve to anger his nobles. In 1259, King Henry III and Louis IX had signed the Treaty of Paris, which stated that lands in France owned by the English, such as Gascony, were held by the English kings as a vassal to France, and that the English kings had to pay homage to each new French king as their feudal overlord for holding these lands. Whenever a new king of either country was crowned, the English kings found this practice demeaning, and the French kings resented the English kings holding so much land in France. As part of the Treaty of Paris, failure to pay homage to the King of France in a timely manner would lead to the confiscation of the held lands, and indeed, Philip IV did seize Gascony from Edward I in 1294, when Edward refused to travel to Paris to discuss an incident at the port of La Rochelle, and so, in August 1297, Edward I left England on a campaign against the French and Philip IV in Flanders to defend his territory in Gascony, which had been occupied by the French king's forces. Edward II, who was only 13 at the time, was left behind and made regent in the king's absence, but this was not an easy time for Edward to be regent, as during that same year, William Wallace had defeated the English at Stirling Bridge, and there was also great disagreement between Edward I and the Earls of Norfolk and Hereford, which made it an unsettled time in England. The outcome of the French campaign for Edward I was the peace treaty he signed with King Philip IV, which outlined an agreement whereby King Edward I, whose first wife Eleanor had died in 1290, would marry Philip's half-sister Margaret, whilst his son would marry Philip's daughter Isabella at some point in the future, as, at the time, she was just an infant. This agreement gave the English monarchy the key territory of Guyenne, as well as ensuring the return of Eleanor of Castile's lands in Ponthieu and Montreuil. But, more importantly, it would ensure that a descendant of both kings would rule the Duchy of Gascony in the future, and so prevent further conflict. Edward I's marriage to Margaret produced two stepbrothers for young Edward, Thomas of Brotherton and Edmund of Woodstock in 1300 and 1301, and the relationship between the extended step-family and Edward was seemingly cordial, as when he was later crowned king, Edward would provide his two stepbrothers with both income and titles. In 1300, when Edward I returned to Scotland as part of his ongoing campaign, he took young Edward along, making him commander of the rear guard at the siege of Calaverock, and on the 7th of February 1301, the king made Edward Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester, granting him extensive lands across North Wales in an attempt not only to give Edward his own income, but also to help pacify the region. Edward also joined the king on the campaign of 1301 in Scotland, which saw him capture Turnberry Castle, and in 1303, he used his own siege engine to besiege Brechin Castle, and in the spring of 1304, he took part in peace negotiations on behalf of his father with the Scottish rebels, but when no agreement was found, he joined his father once more for the siege of Stirling Castle. The year 1305 was marked by a quarrel that young Prince Edward had with Walter Langton, the royal treasurer, over the amount of money Edward received from the crown. His father sided with the treasurer, and Edward and his companions were banished from court, and his financial support was curtailed. However, the rift didn't last long, and father and son were soon reconciled. In 1306, Edward I had been greatly angered by the actions of his former ally, Robert the Bruce, including his crowning at Scone Abbey as King of Scotland and his stabbing to death of his great enemy, John the Red Comyn, in the Franciscan Greyfriars Church in Dumfries. Prior to the crowning of Robert the Bruce, there had been a 10-year interregnum in Scotland, from when the previous King John Balliol had been removed from the throne in 1296, and whilst the English kings of the time did not lay claim to the Scottish throne, they did feel entitled to interfere in Scottish affairs, and they also believed that the Scottish kings owed fealty or loyalty to the kings of England in return for the kingdom they ruled. Both Edward I and Edward II would not recognize Robert the Bruce as King of the Scots, and the same was true of the Pope, because of Bruce's killing of John Comyn on sacred ground, and much of Edward II's reign would be marked by constant campaigns to defeat Robert the Bruce and claim his position as overlord of Scotland. And so, on the 7th of April 1306, when King Edward I made his son Duke of Aquitaine, his intention was for Edward to lead the campaign against Robert the Bruce and finally quash the Scottish rebels. Edward II was knighted by his father on the 22nd of May 1306 in Westminster Palace, and he then, in turn, knighted 300 other young men in Westminster Abbey. This ceremony became known as the Feast of the Swans, since Edward had a pair of golden swans brought before the gathering, and after the meal Edward would also swear an oath at this gathering that he would not sleep 2 nights in one place until the Scots had been defeated. Listening to Edward's promise were Piers Gaveston and Hugh Despencer, the Earls of Surrey and Arundel, and also there was Roger Mortimer, who was to play a great part in Edward II's downfall 20 years later. During this time, Edward's extravagant gestures towards Gaveston continued. One example will be the incident recorded by Walter of Diesborough, who recounts that in 1307, Edward told his father the king of his intention to give his favourite Piers Gaveston the title of Count of Ponthieu, which Edward had inherited from his mother, Eleanor of Castile, on her death. This reportedly caused the king to fly into a rage and defame Edward and even to lay hands on him, possibly saying that he would not have Edward inherit his lands, would it not split the kingdom. It is also thought that Piers Gaveston may have been involved in an argument that Edward II had with the treasurer Walter Langton in 1305, following which Gaveston and Edward had been banished from court. However, the incident of 1307 was deemed much more serious by the king, as it resulted in him sending Gaveston into exile on the continent from the 30th of April 1307. But the exile was more of a punishment for Edward rather than Gaveston himself, and even though he was looked after financially by Edward I, as he gave him a dowry of 100 marks a year while he was absent, young Edward, generous as ever, made sure that Gaveston left the kingdom with horses, luxurious clothes, as well as £260. The Scala Chronica states that the reason for Gaveston's banishment in 1307 was that he was, quote, accused before the king of diverse crimes and vices which rendered him unfit company for the king's son. But it is likely that the real reason he was seen as unfit company was because of Edward's love and favoritism towards him, which the king felt might cause resentment amongst the nobles when Edward became king himself. Indeed, while his father lay dying in Bur-by-Sands, it was recorded by one chronicler that he gathered his nobles around him and instructed them to take care of young Edward, but also to prevent the return from exile of Gaveston. These nobles included Henry de Lacy, the Earl of Lincoln, Guy de Beauchamp, the Earl of Warwick, and Aymer de Valence, who would later become the Earl of Pembroke. Edward II's reign would be marked by controversy concerning the exact nature of his relationship with Piers Gaveston, but also because of his blatant favoritism. Indeed, following his father's death, Edward immediately recalled Gaveston from the exile in France that King Edward I had sent him to, despite knowing that it was against his father's wishes. This first act as king would come to typify his political naivety, as would his favoritism to male followers during his reign, which greatly antagonized the great earls, just as his father had feared. King Edward I died at the age of 68 on the 7th of July 1307, in Bur-by-Sands, on his way once again, accompanied by a large army, to confront Robert the Bruce. He died with Scotland's borders within sight, but whilst his son, and now the new King Edward II, had been on his way to join his father, he had decided to stop and turn back when he reached Northampton, and he sent his father 2 barrels of expensive sturgeon in his place. However, on hearing the news that his father had died, Edward II left London and started the march north to Carlisle. On the 23rd of July, Edward oversaw the departure of his father's funeral procession for London at Westminster Abbey, led by the Bishop of Durham, Anthony Beck, and Edward then set off on the 30-mile march to Dumfries, with the aim of hunting down Robert the Bruce and also meeting up with his favourite, Piers Gaveston, which he did when he arrived in Dumfries in August, and it was speculated that this would have been an emotional meeting, due to the fact that Edward, by this time, loved Gaveston deeply and hadn't seen him since April. Edward II had inherited the earldom of Cornwall from his father, who in turn had inherited it from the childless Earl Edmund, nephew of Henry III. But on the 6th of August 1307, just a month after his father's death, Edward passed it on to his favourite Piers Gaveston, again, much to the annoyance of the earls, who were forced to put their seals to the charter, which is today housed in the National Archives in Kew, and only one dissenting earl refused to sign the charter. That was the Earl of Warwick. The earldom of Cornwall had been one of the great titles of the Plantagenet era, and included lands in the southwest as well as Berkshire, Oxfordshire and Yorkshire, with an income of around £4,000 per year. And not only did Edward bestow this title on Gaveston, who the earl saw as unworthy, but he also promised him the hand in marriage of Margaret de Clare, the daughter of the powerful Gilbert, Earl of Gloucester, and Joan of Acre, Edward's sister. However, This act, which many saw as overly generous and inappropriate for a person of Gaveston's low standing, would also be a decision that would ultimately prove dangerous politically for Edward, as his love and favour for Gaveston was an indisputable fact, as was the gulf between their backgrounds, which was large, and these indignities and injustices greatly angered the earls. But it was also frowned upon by Edward I's second wife, Margaret of France, who had hopes that the title would have gone to one of her sons, and Edward's half-brothers, Thomas of Brotherton or Edmund of Woodstock. Whilst still in Dumfries in 1307 after the death of Edward I, the Scottish lords loyal to Edward II paid homage to him, and then, on the 12th of August, Edward started the march north to pursue Robert the Bruce, accompanied by Gaveston. But, after passing through Sanquhar to reach Cumnock in the southern territories of Scotland, it seemed that nothing of any value was being achieved, and so they marched south again to Carlisle, and then on to Knaresborough Castle in Yorkshire, which was now owned by Gaveston. Edward had inherited debts of some £200,000 from his father's reign when he came to the throne, but a good king should have been able to refinance and cope with his deficit, and one of the greater challenges left to Edward II by his father was the critical issue of the extent of English control in Scotland, as Edward I's long military campaign against the Scots and his issues with Robert the Bruce had not been concluded before his death. Whilst some chroniclers at the time claimed that the new king abandoned the campaign in Scotland in 1307 as he was eager to return south to marry his young fiancée Isabella, it was probably more likely that he wanted to return to take over the running of his father's government and make the necessary arrangements both for his wedding in France and, more importantly, his own coronation. And so it was that Edward II abandoned the war in Scotland in August 1307 and marched south, first into Yorkshire, and then on to Nottingham in September, and then to Northampton in October, where he would hold his first parliament in order to make the necessary arrangements for his father's funeral and for his coronation and wedding to Isabella of France, which took place in January 1308 in Boulogne. Edward II was betrothed 4 times during his childhood. The first time was to Margaret, the Maid of Norway, his cousin and daughter of Eric II of Norway, and granddaughter of Alexander III of Scotland, who, on Alexander's death in 1286, became Queen of Scotland. But a marriage between her and Edward II would never happen, as in September 1290, she died at the age of only 7. His second betrothal was in 1291, when Edward was 7, and was to Blanche, a half-sister of Philip IV of France. But following the war that ensued between Edward I and Philip IV, the engagement was called off, and Edward was then betrothed to Philippa, daughter of the Count of Flanders, who was Edward I's ally. But this betrothal was ended when, in 1297, Edward I and Philip IV made peace. However, it was the betrothal that took place in 1299 to Isabella, daughter of Philip IV, which was the one that ended in marriage for Edward II. The funeral of Edward I took place at Westminster Abbey on the 27th of October 1307, where he was buried close to both his first wife, Eleanor of Castile, and his father, Henry III, in the chapel of Edward the Confessor. Following his father's funeral, Edward published an edict which stated that Gaveston should henceforth be addressed only by his title as Earl of Cornwall, which was intended to force the nobility to accept him as their equal and show him due respect. He also wanted Gaveston to be part of his royal family, so he made sure that the promise of marriage for Piers Gaveston to Edward's niece, Margaret de Clare, was kept. And so, in November 1307, only 5 days after Edward I's funeral, Piers Gaveston married Margaret de Clare, Edward II's niece, daughter of Gilbert, Earl of Gloucester and Joan of Acre, Edward's own sister. His niece, Margaret, was only 13 at that time, and Gaveston was in his mid-20s. Gaveston held a jousting tournament in honour of his new bride, at which his knights defeated the Earls of Hereford, Surrey, and Arundel, increasing their feelings of hostility towards him, as they felt he was both arrogant and low-born. They also hated the fact that he monopolised Edward II's attention, being constantly present at court when Edward saw his barons, earls, and other nobles. Edward II, King of England, ascended to the throne of England at his coronation on the 20th of July 1307, at Carlisle Castle. He was named King of England and Lord of Ireland, adding another 2 titles to the 4 he already held, and luckily for Edward, opposition to the royals was minimal at this time, as the Earl of Norfolk and the Earl of Hereford, who had caused Edward I some trouble, had recently died, and Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, and Gilbert, Earl of Gloucester, were his cousin and nephew respectively. As well as this, Walter Langton, the royal treasurer and Gaveston's enemy, who had clashed with Edward II in 1305, was fired, his lands were taken, and he was imprisoned. However, Archbishop Winchelsea of Canterbury, who had been exiled by his father, was restored to the bishopric by the Pope at Edward's request. This action would prove to be one of Edward's many mistakes as king, as Winchelsea would become one of Edward's fiercest enemies. Then, on the 26th of December 1307, Edward appointed Gaveston as Custo Regni, or Keeper of the Realm, while he travelled to France to marry his bride Isabella, giving the nobles even more reason to dislike Gaveston, as such a prominent role would normally be carried out by a high court official, a member of the royal family, or an archbishop, and so Edward's actions gave Gaveston power over the realm, confirmed by a great seal. Edward and Isabella had been promised to each other since 1299, when Edward was 15 and Isabella was 3 or 4, and in Boulogne in France on the 25th of January 1308, Edward II married the 12-year-old Isabella, who was 11 years his junior, and reportedly very beautiful, as well as greedy and extremely extravagant, but also compassionate, pious, and courageous, and their early marriage, at least until the 1370s, was quite successful. Isabella proving to be an ally and great companion to Edward, with Isabella becoming pregnant with their first child 4 years after their marriage, at the age of 16. The negotiations with Philip IV over the size of Isabella's dowry had not been easy for the English royals, during which Edward agreed to pay homage to Philip for the Duchy of Aquitaine, and to finish the implementation of the 1303 Treaty of Paris. In return, Philip gave Isabella wedding gifts worth over 21,000 livres, and reputedly a fragment of the True Cross, and Edward gave his bride a psalter, an illuminated manuscript containing the Book of Psalms. Their coronation took place at Westminster Abbey on Sunday the 25th of February 1308, in the presence of the nobles of England and France. The abbey had been restored and was adorned with a fountain producing wine, as well as marble tables and 40 ovens, and it was Piers Gaveston, immediately preceding the King and Queen in the procession, who carried the royal crown of Edward the Confessor, the most sacred of all the royal regalia carried at the ceremony, which was carried out of the abbey by Henry Woodlock, the Bishop of Winchester. Edward entered the abbey dressed in green silk and walking on a carpet of petals, and it was recorded in the Annals Paulini that Gaveston was so elegantly dressed in purple silk encrusted with pearls that he even outshone the king. Furthermore, Gaveston also led the procession out of the abbey, carrying the royal sword of Edward the Confessor Katana, which had been carried into the abbey by the Earl of Lancaster. In addition, the banqueting hall walls were adorned with Edward and Gaveston's arms, rather than Edward and Isabella's, and Gaveston took pride of place next to Edward II, and was the subject of his rapt attention. All this was seen as rather insulting to the young Queen Isabella, and only served to anger the English nobles further, as well as the French king. Indeed, Isabella wrote to her father that Edward was an entire stranger to my bed, and suggested that Gaveston was the cause of this. However, it should be remembered that marriages to young brides at this time were marriages in name only, until the girl was of childbearing age, so Edward's inattention to Isabella can be understood in this context, as she was only 12 at that time and considered young, even by the standards of the period. And so, for their first years together, Edward would probably have employed the sexual services of a mistress. Whilst the marriage of Edward II and Isabella did not get off to the best of starts, there is evidence from their letters to suggest that there developed a real affection between them, Edward calling Isabella "my dear heart," and Isabella referring to Edward II as "my very sweet heart." And indeed, their marriage produced 4 children. Their first son was the future King Edward III, born in 1312. Their second son, John of Eltham, was born in 1316. Their first daughter, Eleanor of Woodstock, was born in 1318, and Joan was born in 1321, and Edward's illegitimate son Adam was probably born in about 1307, before Isabella and Edward were married. The early days of their marriage, however, were not an easy time for Edward, as the favoritism that he showed to Piers Gaveston led the country to the brink of civil war. Indeed, the position of the nobles was also held by Philip IV of France, who saw his daughter's treatment by Edward as caused by Gaveston, and Edward's stepmother, who was also Philip's half-sister Margaret, also had reason to dislike Gaveston, and was said to have sent £40,000 to the English nobles to fund their opposition of him. Although Gaveston's return from exile in 1307 had initially been accepted by the earls, opposition was beginning to grow once more, not least because of the influence he held over Edward. As one chronicler put it, 2 kings reigning in one kingdom, the one in name and the other in deed. And he also provoked anger concerning his prominent role at Edward's coronation, and perhaps as a result of this animosity, he was accused both of stealing royal funds as well as Isabella's wedding gifts. Indeed, at the Parliament of February 1308, the earls refused to discuss government reform with Edward until the matter of Gaveston had been resolved, and the heated discussion was only cooled with the intervention of the Earl of Lincoln, Henry de Lacy, who asked the other earls to back down, and it was only Hugh Despencer the Elder who supported Edward. However, at a session of Parliament in May 1308, the opposition of the nobles to Gaveston resulted in Henry de Lacy, the Earl of Lincoln, requesting that Gaveston be exiled to Aquitaine, under threat of excommunication should he return, and so, faced with civil war by this time, Edward II agreed to exile his favourite Piers Gaveston, who had until the 25th of June to leave England or face excommunication, and, although Edward agreed initially, he decided instead to send Gaveston across the Irish Sea, and made him King's Lieutenant of Ireland. At a third meeting of Parliament in August 1308 to discuss reform, Edward put forward a plan for another military campaign against Scotland, but this was sidelined, and secretly Edward began negotiations with Pope Clement V, as well as Philip IV, in order to secure the return of Gaveston to England by offering to suppress the Knights Templars and to release Walter Langton from prison. At a further meeting of Parliament in 1309, the earls, still refusing to allow Gaveston to return from exile, offered Edward further taxes in return for his agreement to a program of governmental reform. However, after Edward assured the Pope that the conflict surrounding Gaveston had subsided, and in the presence of concerns over how the original decision to exile him had been taken, the Pope decided to annul the threat of excommunication and so the way was left open for Gaveston to return to England. Gaveston did in fact arrive back in England in June of 1309, and at the next Parliament in August, Edward made concessions to the earls who had opposed Gaveston by limiting the powers of the royal steward and the marshal of the royal household, as well as agreeing to limit the crown's powers of purveyance, which was the forced selling of provisions for the army at low prices. He also agreed to cancel recently enacted customs legislation. In return, Parliament agreed that Edward should receive more taxes to fund his campaigns in Scotland. It seemed at this point that a compromise might have been reached. However, on his return, Gaveston continued to anger the earls with his arrogant and haughty manner, even seemingly provoking them by giving them insulting nicknames such as the Black Dog of Arden for the Earl of Warwick, Joseph the Jew for the Earl of Pembroke, Shirl for the Earl of Lancaster, Whoreson for the Earl of Gloucester, and Burst Belly for the Earl of Lincoln. In fact, Warwick was recorded as saying, quote, "If he calls me a dog, be sure that I will bite him, so soon as I shall perceive my opportunity." The unrest culminated at the earls coming to the Parliament of February 1310, armed and demanding that Edward put right the problems facing the realm at that time. These issues were that the hard-won lands his father had acquired in Scotland were now being lost again to Scotland, and that Edward was being misled by evil counsel and was wasting treasury money, and further, that he could not manage his own household, as his officials would take goods from the poor by the misuse of his powers of purveyance, and that he had brought shame on the country, which was now divided. It was then that Edward, faced with a possible revolt, was forced to agree in March 1310 to the formation of a group of 21 earls known as the Lords Ordainer to replace Gaveston as Edward's counsel and reform the governance of England as well as Edward's own household. Then, in September of 1310, Edward and Gaveston took an army of 4,700 men to Scotland, but Robert the Bruce would not give battle, and so, with little progress made over the winter and supplies and money running low, Edward returned south in the summer of 1311. However, in Edward's absence in Scotland, Anthony Beck, Bishop of Durham, had died. As well as this, Edward's regent Henry de Lacy, the Earl of Lincoln, had also died. With Lincoln's death, Edward's cousin Thomas, the Earl of Lancaster, grew even more powerful as he inherited Lincoln's earldoms through his wife Lincoln's sister, and so now held Lancaster, Leicester, Lincoln, Salisbury and Derby, with an income of around £11,000 a year from his lands, making him by far the most powerful and wealthy earl in England. And he had wielded this power whilst Edward was in Scotland, as Lancaster was duty-bound to give homage to Edward for the lands he held, but refused to do so in Scotland, forcing Edward to cross the Tweed to accept homage from Lancaster in Haggerston. During Edward's absence in Scotland, the Ordainers had drawn up the Ordinances of 1311, which Edward accepted in October 1311. The reforms limited the king's authority to go to war or to grant lands without Parliament's approval. It also gave Parliament control of the royal administration, as well as abolishing the system of purveyance, and it also excluded the borrowing of money from the Italian Frescobaldi bankers, to whom Edward, by this time, owed £21,000. In addition, a system was implemented to check the ordinances were being kept, but most devastating for Edward, the ordinances exiled Gaveston once more, insisting that he should not be allowed to live in any lands owned by Edward, including Gascony and Ireland, and that he should lose his titles. Edward was forced to accept Gaveston's exile, although it took 6 weeks for him to agree to that particular clause of the ordinances. and later he sought advice on the exiles of others as to how he might bring him back, but ultimately Gaveston was ordered into exile by the 1st of November 1311. However, he left later than ordered on the 3rd or 4th of November from the Thames, possibly for northern France or Flanders. Despite Gaveston's departure from England, the tension between Edward and the earls remained high, and when further ordinances ordered that other members of his household sympathetic to Gaveston should leave, this further angered the king, and perhaps feeling that his royal power was being stripped, he decided to revoke the ordinances and recalled Gaveston from exile in early 1312, giving him back his title Earl of Cornwall. Edward spent Christmas with Isabella, but left Westminster on the 27th of December 1311 and headed north with Gaveston's wife, his niece Margaret, who was now heavily pregnant, arriving in York, where Margaret gave birth on the 12th of January 1311 to Gaveston's daughter Joan, named after Edward's sister Joan of Acre, and so Edward then met up with Gaveston on the 13th of January, and they travelled together to York so that Gaveston could see his wife and newborn daughter. The earls met in London and stopped further funding for the king and planned their capture of Gaveston. However, Edward was bent on saving his favourite at all costs, even asking Robert the Bruce to give him sanctuary. But Robert refused, and the desperate request showed that Edward's love of Gaveston was evidently more important to him than the overlordship of Scotland, the loyalty of his earls, and perhaps even his throne. Isabella then left for York, and she was reunited with her husband in late February 1312 at Bishopthorpe just south of York, where they promptly conceived their first son, who would later become King Edward III. Subsequently, Edward and Gaveston, who the Archbishop of Canterbury had excommunicated in March, left for Newcastle on the 5th of April 1312, with Isabella also arriving there on the 22nd of April, later moving on to Tynemouth Priory, maybe because by this time Gaveston was ill. They were pursued to Newcastle by Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. Despite this, Edward found time to celebrate his 28th birthday on the 25th of April by buying Isabella some large white pearls with £40 he had borrowed from a Genoese merchant, and during this time, Edward also gave Gaveston custody of Scarborough Castle, on order he should give it over to no one but the king himself, should he have need of it, showing that Edward, by this time, was resigned to civil war, and he had also ordered his vassals in France, the Counts of Foix and Armagnac, and the Lord of Albret, along with 120 Gascon viscounts and barons, to come to his aid in England, with armed men and horses. When, on the 3rd of May, Edward heard of the imminent arrival of Lancaster and his army, they fled to join Isabella at Tynemouth, and on the 5th of May they travelled by sea to Scarborough Castle, leaving behind much of their household and valuables, with Isabella travelling by land instead. Edward then left Gaveston at Scarborough and travelled to Knaresborough and then York, where he met up with Isabella again on the 14th of May. Meanwhile, Lancaster seized the king's possessions left behind at Tynemouth, which included a gold ring with an enormous ruby called the Cherry, and a gold cup studded with jewels, along with 63 horses. On the day the king left Scarborough Castle for York, Gaveston was besieged there by John de Warenne, the Earl of Surrey, Henry Percy, Aymer de Valence, the Earl of Pembroke, and Sir Roger de Clifford, and despite the king requesting them to desist, Gaveston surrendered to them on the 19th of May, on condition he be kept unharmed and under house arrest at his own castle in Wallingford, until he could account for his actions to Parliament on the 1st of August. Placed under the custody of the Earl of Pembroke, Gaveston was taken south to Wallingford, but they stopped at Deddington, some 30 miles short of Wallingford, on the 9th of June, and that night, Pembroke left Gaveston under guard at Dedington Priory while he visited his wife Beatrice, and it was on the morning of the 10th of June that Gaveston awoke to the sound of horses and men surrounding the priory. It was de Beauchamp, the Earl of Warwick, who Gaveston had insultingly called the Black Dog of Earden. He had come for revenge. Warwick then took Gaveston to Warwick Castle, after publicly walking him through the streets of Dedington, stripped of his belt of knighthood, barefoot and bareheaded. He was thrown into the dungeons of Warwick Castle and put in chains, and after a brief trial on the 18th of June, he was found guilty of being a traitor by breaking the ordinances, and was run through and beheaded at Blacklow Hill the following day by the Welsh men-at-arms of the Earl of Lancaster. His body was taken in by Dominican monks, who sewed back his head, tendered his body, and dressed him, which was paid for by both Edward and Gaveston's widow Margaret, whose family would later be provided for by Edward. That the Dominicans could not bury Gaveston, who was, after all, excommunicate, and so he was not buried until the 2nd of January 1315, when his funeral was held in King's Langley Priory in Hertfordshire, after the Archbishop of Canterbury, Walter Reynolds, absolved his excommunication. The killing of Gaveston caused further division in England, as Edward grieved deeply and was furious with Lancaster in particular, and the division caused by his treatment of Gaveston would cause a permanent rift between the men. Furthermore, the Earls of Pembroke and Surrey also disagreed with what Lancaster had done and moved their support to Edward, and the threat of civil war loomed once again. In December of 1312, the Earl of Pembroke brokered a peace treaty which would pardon the earls for their involvement in the killing of Gaveston, in return for their support for another campaign in Scotland. But an agreement was not reached straight away, and negotiations continued throughout 1313, and a step toward peace was attained when the treaty was finally formalized at a parliament in October of the same year. In June of 1313, Edward and Isabella traveled to Paris with Pembroke, Richmond, and other loyalists, including Hugh Despenser the Elder and Henry Beaumont, to meet with Philip IV to discuss disagreements over the administration of Gascony. However, it was probably also on Edward's agenda to garner support from the French king in his disputes with the English earls. Their visit was an opportunity for Philip to demonstrate his great wealth and power to the English king, and so their tour included the knighting of Philip's son and 200 other men in an elegant and grand ceremony in Notre Dame, and there were also banquets held along the River Seine. As well as this, both men made a declaration that they would join a crusade to the Levant against the Muslims of Egypt, and they also agreed terms for settling their differences in Gascony. The success of the trip was only marred by a fire which broke out in Edward's quarters. On his return from his successful trip to France, Edward found his position in England strengthened both politically and financially, as the earls had agreed to the peace treaty by October 1313. As well as this, Parliament had agreed to the raising of taxes and loans of £25,000 from the Pope and £33,000 from Philip, as well as further loans organized by Edward's new Italian banker, Antonio Pasagmo. In addition, by this time, Edward had an heir, as Isabella had given birth on the 13th of November 1312 to a son, Edward, at Windsor. Baby Edward's arrival was a cause for celebration and a reason for the country to come together again. He was made Earl of Chester at the age of 12 days, and to mark his birth, Edward had raised his 12-year-old half-brother, Thomas of Brotherton, to the rank of Earl of Norfolk. However, some earls were still disgruntled about other loyalist supporters of the king and their influence over him, including Hugh Despenser the Elder, who had consistently remained loyal to Edward. As well as rumblings of disquiet at home, Edward still had Robert the Bruce to deal with, who had by now taken most of the castles in Scotland once held by Edward, and so he set out for the north with a 15 to 20,000 strong force, supported by Gloucester, Hereford and Pembroke, as well as Hugh Despencer and Roger Clifford. However, the Earls of Lancaster, Warwick, Arundel and Surrey were missing, and they sent the minimum forces they were legally obliged to, fearing that a victory in Scotland for Edward would mean that they would be at risk from his forces once they returned. By late May, Edward had reached Berwick, where he heard news that Stirling Castle was under siege from Robert the Bruce, and the English commander of Stirling sent word that unless Edward arrived with relief forces by the 24th of June, he would be forced to surrender. Meanwhile, Robert's forces were preparing for Edward's arrival, and on the 23rd of June 1314, the two sides met on the high ground of Bannockburn, surrounded by the marshy land bordering the burn. With Robert's Scottish forces of 500 cavalry and 6,000 infantry spearmen divided into 3 divisions or schiltrons under his command, alongside him were his brother Edward Bruce and his nephew, the Earl of Moray. On the first day of battle, Robert killed Sir Henry de Bohun with a blow of his battle-axe. Gloucester and Hereford quarrelled over who should lead the vanguard, and Gloucester was lucky to escape with his life, and so the English then withdrew for the night. On the following day, the 24th of June, Edward encountered Robert's troops unexpectedly at New Park, with his forces in marching formation instead of battle formation. As Sir Alexander Seton, a Scottish noble fighting on Edward's side, had defected and informed the Scottish army of Edward's position, and earlier that day Gloucester had argued fiercely with Edward as he felt the troops needed rest before continuing the attack, but Edward disagreed, and so to defend his honour, Gloucester led the first attack of the vanguard against the Scottish infantry, in which he was killed. Edward's archers were at the rear of his formation, and therefore unable to break up Robert's spearmen, who crushed Edward's cavalry as they struggled to fight in the cramped terrain, and so the English army were defeated in a pitched battle in which the Earl of Hereford was captured, and the Earl of Gloucester, Sir Roger de Clifford, and Sir Giles Dargenton, the third best knight in Europe, all lost their lives. Edward was dragged away from the fighting by Aymer de Valence, the Earl of Pembroke, and Sir Giles Dargenton when they realized that all was lost, after which the battle turned into a rout, with the pursuing Scottish army killing the remaining English forces in retreat, and while the English were suffering huge losses, which historian Peter Rees puts at 11,000 infantrymen, Edward retreated to Dunbar, then Berwick, and finally York, during which time Stirling Castle finally fell. Pembroke, Edward's saviour at Bannockburn, and Hereford, released from captivity by the Scots, remained loyal to Edward, as did Henry Beaumont, Hugh Despencer the elder, and his son, Hugh Despencer the younger. In fact, in the years following Gaveston's death, the Despensers helped fill the gap left by the removal of the king's favourite. During the years 1314 to 1317, increasingly harsh winters followed by wet summers throughout Europe resulted in flash floods in 1315, which destroyed arable lands, resulting in the death of thousands of sheep and cattle from disease and starvation, and ultimately famine throughout England for 2 years, as an 80% deficit in crops meant that starving people resorted to eating bird droppings, pets, damp and rotten corn, and on occasion, each other. The loss of export revenue for wool and the decrease in meat supplies and resulting increase in food prices put pressure on the military garrison near Scotland, while Robert the Bruce pressed further south into England's territories, perhaps spurred on by the loss of English earls at Bannockburn, as well as the death of Warwick, who died in August 1315. And although Edward undertook a military campaign in 1319 to stop the advance, it was unsuccessful, as the famine made it increasingly difficult to keep his garrisons supplied with food. Furthermore, the requisitioning of food for the royal court throughout the famine years brought more discontentment with Edward's rule, as the famine and the Scottish failures were felt to be a punishment from God, and opposition also grew once more around Edward's treatment of his royal favourites. On the death of Gilbert de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester at Bannockburn, his estates were split between his three sisters, as he and his wife Maud had no children of their own, and so three of those loyal to Edward, Hugh de Audley, Roger d'Amory, and Hugh de Spencer the Younger, received large fortunes as they were already married to the sisters of the Earl of Gloucester, Margaret, the widow of Gaveston, Elizabeth and Eleanor respectively, and whilst the three received equal portions of de Clare's fortune, Hugh de Spencer the Younger also received the entire lordship of Glamorgan in Wales, the most important of the de Clare lands politically. From being a landless knight, Hugh de Spencer the Younger had married into the wealthy de Clare family, had become the king's chamberlain, and had acquired Glamorgan and the Welsh Marches in 1317, and both he and his father were loyal to Edward, but Hugh the Younger would develop an ever-increasingly close relationship with Edward over the coming years, as he would rely on Hugh the Younger for advice, and he was also privy to all Edward's court business. In the words of one chronicler, Edward loved him dearly with all his heart and mind. But, despite acquiring so much land, de Spencer the Younger decided to also impinge on the lands of neighbouring Welsh Marcher lords, causing resentment from Roger Mortimer, the Earl of Hereford, his nephew Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, Hugh d'Amory, Hugh de Audley, and Roger d'Amory, who rose up in May 1321, along with Lancaster, and marched through the land, causing damage and destruction and seizing the de Spencer lands in protest over the king's favoritism towards them. And, although this rebellion was crushed, resistance continued under Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, the Marcher lord's ally. Edward faced further conflict and possible civil war when the earls, led by Lancaster, pressured Edward to re-implement the ordinances of 1311, removing a number of royal ministers, replacing all the sheriffs in England, ordering the resumption of royal grants, and putting pressure on Edward to hear petitions of grievance and complaint from his subjects. And, furthermore, much to Edward's displeasure, Hugh de Spencer the Elder and Archbishop Reynolds were removed from their posts in government. Lancaster took virtual control of government when he became the head of a royal council in 1316, which was formed to implement the reforms, but he failed to fulfill the role, becoming isolated from the other earls as well as government, and refusing to meet Edward at Parliament for the next 2 years, bringing governance to a standstill. That after negotiations involving the Earl of Pembroke, further conflict was avoided with the Treaty of Lake in August 1318, which re-established Edward's control, pardoned Lancaster, and established a new royal council to uphold the ordinances. Despite the treaty, however, between 1317 and 1321, relations between Edward, Lancaster and the earls deteriorated further, not least because of Edward's treatment of his favourites, and in June 1321, Lancaster held a meeting of the earls and clergy, which determined that the Despensers had broken the ordinances, and despite Edward's attempts to broker peace, the opposition insisted on the exile of the Despensers, which Edward agreed to for the sake of the realm, but only after Isabella had begged him on her knees. However, Edward swore he would have his revenge, and aided by his half-brothers, some of the earls and clergy and the Earl of Pembroke, he deliberately created an excuse to go to war by having Isabella stop off on her way to pilgrimage at Leeds Castle, which was the stronghold of Bartholomew of Badlesmere, where his wife Margaret, falling for the trick, refused Isabella admittance and killed several of Isabella's contingent, thus giving the king reason to wage war. Edward would soon regain control of the southeast as Lancaster refused to help Badlesmere, who was his enemy. And in January 1322, with the help of the Despensers, who were able to secretly return from exile in mid-January, Edward overcame the opposition forces of the Marcher lords along the River Severn. He was able to advance into the Welsh marches, where Bridgenorth was burned, and Roger Mortimer and his uncle Roger Mortimer de Chirk surrendered to Edward on the 22nd of January 1322, and then, in February, Hugh Audley the Elder and Maurice de Berkeley also surrendered, and Edward confiscated Berkeley Castle from Sir Maurice. Edward was winning not only militarily, but also politically, as in February 1322 a letter came to light that Edward had distributed widely, which showed that Lancaster had been negotiating with the Scots to overcome Edward, and many of Lancaster's allies became wary of supporting him, for fear of what would happen to them should he lose, and it was at this time that the Welsh nobility also lent their support to Edward, as the Marcher lords had been more of a threat to their lands than Edward. Only 10 days after Lancaster's letters were published, he was declared a traitor to the realm, and Edward ordered the Earls of Kent and Surrey to capture Pontefract Castle. Then, as Lancaster and the Earls loyal to him attempted to make their way to Carlisle with a force of around 700 men, they were stopped by Andrew Harclay, the warden of Carlisle Castle, who had an accumulated army of 4,000 men. After the Battle of Burton Bridge in February 1322, Edward had crossed the River Trent and joined Harclay at Borough Bridge, where they engaged Lancaster and his forces at the Battle of Borough Bridge on the 16th of March, where Lancaster and the Lancastrian loyalists were defeated. After a trial at Pontefract, Lancaster was found guilty of treason and beheaded in March 1322, after which Edward repealed the ordinances through the Statute of York at a parliament held on the 2nd of May 1322, retaining only 6 clauses concerning the administration of the household and appointment of sheriffs, and agreeing taxes for a fresh campaign against Scotland, which took back royal power unequivocally, and so by now, Edward was without a doubt back in charge. Following the Despenser War, the 2 Roger Mortimers, Chirk and Wigmore, were sentenced to death, but had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment, and they were imprisoned in the Tower of London, from where Roger Mortimer de Wigmore escaped in August 1323, before fleeing to France, and Maurice de Berkeley, Hugh Audley the Younger and the Elder, were also imprisoned, while, in a last show of resistance, the Marcher lords attempted to free other captives from both Windsor and Wallingford castles. The remaining supporters of Lancaster were either executed or imprisoned, and their lands were seized, which resulted in Edward becoming hugely rich, as, by 1326, his treasury contained £62,000, with which he rewarded his loyal supporters with titles and lands. Andrew Harclay was given the earldom of Carlisle. The loyal Earls of Surrey and Pembroke were both given land holdings. The Earl of Arundel was given lands confiscated from Roger Mortimer of Chirk, as well as his title of Justice of Wales. The king's half-brother Edmund was given land and castles in the Midlands and Wales, and Edward's young son, John of Eltham, was given the Lancastrian castle of Tutbury at the age of only 6. As well as this, Hugh Despenser the Elder was given the earldom of Winchester, along with 5 separate grants of land, including Lancaster's territory of Denbigh in North Wales. Hugh Despenser the Younger received all the lands of the earldom of Gloucester, but not the title, and he was also given extensive land holdings in Wales, which were added to substantially over the coming years, in effect making him Lord of South Wales with an income of around £5,000 per year. The king was granted £40,000 for another campaign in Scotland, which came to nothing. but which also resulted in the death of his illegitimate son Adam, and almost ended in Queen Isabella's capture when she was forced to flee Tynemouth by sea. Andrew Harclay tried to negotiate a peace treaty independently with Robert the Bruce, under terms which would force Edward to recognize Robert as rightful King of Scotland, in return for a cessation to the invasion of England. Unsurprisingly, the king was furious at Harclay's unauthorized intervention and immediately cruelly executed him as a common traitor. But the king did agree to a 13-year truce with Scotland. Bolstered by his swelling coffers and his victory over Lancaster, Edward became emboldened, and his loyal dispensers gathered the fruits of their loyalty whilst dealing cruelly with anyone who crossed them. Moreover, there was still discontentment with Edward's favoritism of them. Indeed, the chronicler Thomas de la Moore stated that under Edward, England had 3 kings at once. However, the success enjoyed by Edward would not last for long, as stories began to circulate of miracles happening, both at Lancaster's tomb and at the gallows used to execute his followers, and in addition, law and order broke down, with the confusion caused by the many seizures of land. And then, on the 1st of August 1323, at the Tower of London, Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, now Langless, escaped from his dungeon and fled to France, where he was welcomed by the new King of France, Charles IV, Edward's brother-in-law. The new King Charles IV was eager to assert his authority over England, and a disagreement over Edward's lands at Salsado in 1324 gave him the excuse he needed, and so he invaded Edward's territory of Gascony over a dispute concerning the killing of a French sergeant who intended to build a fortified town in a disputed region on the Gascon border, which Edward denied responsibility for and sent the Earl of Pembroke to protest, but he died en route, and instead of compromising, Charles intensified his attack. In August 1324, the French king's uncle Charles of Valois invaded Aquitaine. In response, Edward ordered the arrest of any French citizen in England and seized all French-held lands in England, including Isabella's. And so the clergy and earls recommended the raising of an army of 11,000 men to invade Gascony, which Edward sent to France, led by the Earl of Surrey, as he felt that if he left England accompanied by his loyal earls, that he would leave the country open to invasion or rebellion. In the meantime, Edward recommenced negotiations with King Charles IV, who suggested that Isabella travel to France along with Prince Edward to give homage to the French king for Gascony, and in return, Charles would end the war and return the disputed region of Agenais. But as Edward was concerned about sending his son to France, he sent Isabella alone instead, in March 1325. The negotiations were not easy for Isabella, but she appealed to her brother Charles directly, and it was eventually agreed that Edward would pay homage in person for his lands in Gascony. However, as Edward was still concerned about possible uprisings in England were he to leave, he gave the Duchy of Aquitaine to his son Edward instead and sent him to pay homage to Charles in his place. Therefore, the young Prince Edward crossed the Channel and paid homage to his uncle, the French King Charles IV, in September 1325, and following this, Edward had expected the return of his family to England. But instead, Isabella remained in France. Edward and Isabella's marriage had been successful in the beginning, but by the time she left for France in 1325, the Queen was feeling discontent with Edward's treatment of her, not least because of his behavior towards his favorites. But there were other issues, as Isabella seemed to have disliked Hugh Despenser the Younger personally, maybe because of his mistreatment of highborn women at court, or maybe because she felt humiliated that her own money from Edward came via Despenser. She was also embarrassed that she had cause to flee Scottish forces on no fewer than 3 occasions during her marriage, the last of which, in 1322, she blamed Despenser for directly. In addition to this, Edward had also arranged terms with Robert the Bruce, which had disadvantaged the Beaumonts, who were landowners in Scotland and friends of Isabella. She was also unhappy about the seizure of her own lands in 1324 and the arrest of her entire household. And perhaps, worst of all, Edward had taken away her children and given custody of them to the wife of Hugh Despenser the Younger, Eleanor de Clare, who was also employed to spy on Isabella's correspondence. Unsurprisingly, Isabella was by this time happy to lead England, and after her duties were completed negotiating on behalf of England, she spent the summer in France, during her brother's properties, and it would soon become apparent that Isabella would not be returning, and she wrote to Edward complaining about her treatment and Edward's favor of Despenser. Isabella had met Roger Mortimer of Wigmore at Christmas 1325, and by February 1326 had formed a relationship with Edward's enemy, with whom she had much in common. They both wanted the removal of Edward from power, as well as to be rid of the Despensers, and so they plotted together. Edward, by this time, had heard of their relationship and asked Pope John XXII to force the French king to intervene on his behalf. And, facing excommunication, Charles was forced to demand that Isabella and Mortimer leave France. Isabella and Roger Mortimer attracted a following of Edward's opponents whilst in Paris, and sought safe haven with William the Count of Hainault, and whilst there, Mortimer proposed a marriage between Prince Edward and 12-year-old Philippa, the daughter of Count William, and so the marriage was agreed on the 27th of August, and in return for this prestigious alliance with the heir to the English throne, and a sizable dowry for the bride, Count William provided 132 transport vessels and 8 warships to assist in Mortimer's invasion of England. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer's invasion of England was launched. The fleet comprised of 95 ships. Meanwhile, in England, Edward had been preparing for an attack either from France or from Mortimer, and in anticipation, he prepared fleets at Portsmouth in the south and Orwell on the east coast near present-day Ipswich. As well as this, Edward also tried to rally the people to support him in the event of an invasion. However, his support was weak from the local peoples, and his nobles were either incompetent or disloyal, as when he ordered some 2,000 men to gather at Orwell, only 55 actually arrived. On the 24th of September 1326, Roger Mortimer, Isabella and Prince Edward, accompanied by Edward's half-brother Edmund of Woodstock, landed on the east coast at Orwell with a small force of 700 that were met with no resistance, and instead the enemies of Edward and the Despensers came to join them, including Edward's other half-brother Thomas of Brotherton and Henry of Lancaster, who had inherited the title from his brother Thomas of Lancaster. Whilst residing at the Tower of London, Edward tried to raise support in the capital. However, instead, there was anarchy in London, and mobs killed Edward's remaining officials, including his treasurer Walter Stapleton, in St. Paul's Cathedral, taking the tower and releasing Edward's prisoners, and so Edward fled the city, accompanied by the Despensers, reaching Gloucester between the 9th and 12th of October, with Mortimer and Isabella giving chase, with an ever-increasing force of local allies, some motivated by Isabella's promise of monetary rewards for their support, published on the Eleanor Cross at Cheapside. Edward and Hugh Despenser the Younger set sail from Chepstow, headed for Lundy and then Ireland, in the hope of raising a fresh army. But bad weather forced them back to Cardiff, from where they retreated to Caerphilly Castle, and in Edward's absence it was now that his rule collapsed, and Isabella's supporters took over the administration of the country, backed by the clergy. Meanwhile, Isabella's forces were surrounding Bristol, where Hugh Despenser the Elder had taken refuge. He, promptly surrendered and was executed, whilst Edward and Hugh Despenser the Younger fled Caerphilly Castle on the 2nd of November, leaving valuables behind including £13,000 in cash. However, they were betrayed and captured north of Caerphilly and escorted to Monmouth Castle, and then on to Henry Lancaster's castle at Kenilworth, whilst Edward's remaining supporters, besieged in Caerphilly Castle, finally surrendered in April 1327. A parliament was called by Isabella and Mortimer, and Edward was forced to relinquish his throne on the grounds that his weak leadership and personal faults had driven the country to the brink of disaster, and as such, he was incompetent to rule. Following that, on the 20th of January 1327, Henry of Lancaster and the bishops of Winchester and Lincoln met privately with Edward and informed him that his son Edward would only inherit his throne if he were to abdicate. With tears in his eyes, Edward agreed to abdicate, and Sir William Trussell, representing the kingdom, withdrew his fealty and formally ended Edward II's reign, and so his son, Prince Edward, was proclaimed king on the 25th of January 1327 in London, and crowned King Edward III at Westminster Abbey on the 1st of February at the age of 14. It was now time for Isabella and Mortimer to take revenge, and so Hugh Despenser the Younger was sent to trial, declared a traitor, and sentenced to death by disembowelment, castration, and quartering, and was executed on the 24th of November 1326, whilst Edward's former Chancellor Robert Baldock died in Fleet Prison, and the Earl of Arundel was beheaded. The victor's problem lay, however, on what was to be done with Edward of Carnarvon, as the old king would now be known, a remaining king, but of possible future threat, as those opposed to the new regime were making plans to free Edward, and so the old king was moved to Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire, a more secure position, where Edward arrived on the 5th of April 1327. Edward was kept under the custody of Mortimer's son-in-law Thomas Berkeley and John Maltravers, who were given £5 a day to look after Edward, and, despite records showing luxury goods being bought for him, doubts exist as to how well looked after he actually was. As some chroniclers suggest, he may well have been mistreated, and also, during this time, there were several attempts from those loyal to Edward to free him from captivity. However, on the 21st of September 1327, Isabella and Mortimer's problems were solved when Edward II died at Berkeley Castle at the age of 43, supposedly from natural causes, but the timing of his death was most opportune for the couple, and suspicions arose as to the circumstances surrounding his death. On the 23rd of September 1327, Edward III was informed of his father's death, and following this, several of those who might have been involved in Edward's untimely demise fled, including Sir Thomas Gurney, Maltravers, and William Oakley. Isabella and Mortimer ruled as de facto rulers from 1327 to 1330, due to the age of Edward III, during which time they signed the Treaty of Northampton, making peace with the Scots. In addition, they both amassed and spent great wealth, both actions being highly unpopular with the people of England, and Mortimer also lost the favour of young Edward III, and, in 1330, the young king staged a coup d'etat at Nottingham Castle, arresting Mortimer and later executing him in November 1330 for 14 counts of treason, including the murder of Edward II. The new King Edward III blamed Mortimer for all the recent problems of the realm, effectively releasing his father of all guilt concerning the events, perhaps out of love, or perhaps to increase the legitimacy of his own reign. And he was also merciful and generous to Isabella, giving her a suitable allowance and returning her to public life. The body of Edward II was embalmed at Berkeley Castle and presented for viewing to the local leaders, It was then taken to Gloucester Abbey on the 21st of October 1327, where he was buried on the 20th of December by the high altar, using a temporary wooden effigy with a copper crown in the procession. Perhaps because of deterioration of his body, which had been dead for 3 months by then, Edward III gave his father a prestigious funeral costing £350, with gilt lion standards painted in gold leaf and oak barriers to control the crowds. He was buried in the shirt, gloves and coif or cap used at his coronation, and his effigy was later replaced by an alabaster version, which depicts him with a protruding lower lip, which is possibly a close likeness, holding a king's scepter and orb, and wearing a strawberry-leafed crown. Edward's heart was placed in a silver container, which was later buried with Isabella at Newgate Church in London. But his body was placed in a lead coffin, within an outer wooden coffin, which remains in his tomb at Gloucester Cathedral to this day. Controversy surrounds the circumstances of Edward II's death to this day, but during the mid-1330s accounts arose which stated that Edward had been killed by the insertion of a red-hot poker into his anus. Perhaps this was propaganda due to his alleged homosexuality. However, most later historians dismiss the idea that his captors would have killed him in such an easily detectable fashion. Further accounts suggest that Edward did not, in fact, die in September 1327, but much later, and that Edward actually escaped Berkeley Castle with the help of a servant and became a hermit in the Holy Roman Empire. Indeed, this account began with the Fieschi letter sent by an Italian priest called Manuel Fieschi to Edward III, in which he claimed that the body presented to Isabella and Mortimer was in fact the porter of Berkeley Castle, who was killed by the assassins in an attempt to escape punishment for failing to kill Edward. This story is also linked to the account of a meeting Edward III had with a man called William the Welshman in Antwerp in 1338, who claimed to be Edward II, and the story does receive some support from historians, some saying that Isabella would not have plotted to kill Edward, suggesting that it was in fact Isabella Mortimer who released Edward and then faked his death, and so the idea that Edward may have actually survived does endure to this day. What do you think of Edward II? Was he an incompetent, weak failure of a king who let his emotions get in the way of his kingship and his favorites rule the realm? Or was he more of a reluctant king who did his best but was taken advantage of and was perhaps unsuited to his role? Please let us know what you think in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
If you find this video interesting and useful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with the latest videos.